The night began like any other in the sleepy town of Millville, New Jersey. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine, as 5 college students piled into an old van, their laughter echoing through the quiet streets. Emma, the self-proclaimed leader, held a flashlight in one hand and a worn map in the other, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "This is it, guys," she said, tracing a route on the map. "The Pine Barrens, home of the Jersey Devil, mysterious disappearances, and maybe even some ghosts." "Ghosts?" "Please," scoffed Kevin, adjusting his thick glasses. "You really believe those old stories? It's probably just an owl or some other nocturnal creature." "Yeah, well, something's out there," Emma shot back. "And we're going to find out what." Their destination was a clearing deep within the Pine Barrens, a sprawling forest notorious for its eerie legends and unexplained phenomena. For years, locals had whispered about strange lights, unearthly screams, and people vanishing without a trace. Most dismissed the stories as campfire tales, but Emma was convinced there was truth to the rumors. As the van bounced along the dirt road, the group joked and teased one another, their bravado masking a growing unease. The trees loomed larger the farther they drove, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the night sky. "Hey, did anyone else notice there's no cell service out here?" Sarah, the youngest of the group, said nervously, clutching her phone. "Relax," said Jake, the class clown, grinning as he snapped a photo of her worried face. "We'll be fine. It's not like we're in some horror movie." The van came to a stop near a faded wooden sign that read, "Welcome to the Barrens." The letters were weathered, almost illegible, as though time itself had tried to erase them. Emma led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as they ventured into the forest. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled around them. Even the usual sounds of the night, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves, were absent. "Anyone else getting a bad vibe?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're just letting the stories get to you," Kevin said, though his own voice lacked confidence. An hour into their hike, they reached the clearing Emma had marked on the map. It was smaller than they expected, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, their twisted trunks forming a natural barrier. "All right, let's set up camp," Emma said, unpacking her gear. "We'll stay here tonight and see if anything unusual happens." As the group set up their tents and lit a small fire, a faint, high-pitched sound broke the silence. It was distant, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "It's just the wind," Kevin said, though he didn't sound convinced. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a single word, stretched and distorted, like someone calling from far away. "Help!" The group froze, their eyes darting toward the shadows beyond the firelight. "Who's out there?" Jake called, standing and shining his flashlight toward the trees. "Hello?" No answer. Just the whispering wind and the crackling of the fire. "Okay. That was creepy," Kevin admitted, his bravado crumbling. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Emma said, though her grip on the flashlight tightened. "It could be someone messing with us." But deep down, she knew better. The stories, the warnings from locals. There was something in the Barrens, and now it knew they were here. The first scream came just after midnight. Jake had wandered off, his flashlight bobbing through the trees as he joked about finding the Jersey Devil alone. Then came the scream, raw, primal, and cut short too quickly. "Jake!" Emma shouted, running toward the sound. The others followed, their flashlights flickering as they darted through the forest. They found his flashlight first, lying in the dirt, its beam casting a shaky circle of light. But Jake was gone. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just the flashlight and a chilling silence. "We have to leave," Sarah whispered. tears streaming down her face. "We have to go right now." "We can't just leave him," Emma said, though fear twisted in her stomach. "Then what do we do?" Kevin asked, his voice trembling. "He's gone, Emma. Just gone." Before anyone could answer, the whispering began again, louder this time, surrounding them like a chorus of disembodied voices. "Help! Please! Help!" The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees in a way that defied logic. Panic set in, and the group stumbled back toward the clearing, their breath coming in ragged gasps. When they reached the camp, they found their tents slashed, the fire extinguished, and a single word scratched into the dirt. "Stay." The whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, weaving through the air like an invisible fog that pressed against their ears. Emma stood frozen, staring at the scratched word in the dirt. "Stay." The jagged letters were carved deep, the edges raw, as though done with a sharp blade or claws. "We have to get out of here," Kevin said, his voice shaking. He grabbed Emma's arm, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Forget Jake. We'll call for help when we're safe." But Emma shook her head. "What if he's still out there? We can't just leave him." "Emma," Sarah whispered, clutching her arms tightly. Jake screamed. "You heard it. Whatever did that, it isn't human." Emma opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, the fire suddenly reignited. The flames shot up unnaturally high, burning a brilliant blue before settling into a steady, flickering red. The light cast long shadows across the clearing, warping the shapes of the trees until they looked like clawed hands reaching for the sky. Then the voices returned, but this time they weren't whispers. "Help me," a voice called, loud and desperate. It was Jake's voice. Emma spun around, her flashlight darting toward the sound. "Jake? Jake, where are you?" "Emma!" Sarah screamed, grabbing her arm. "It's not him! Don't go!" But Emma pulled free, her determination outweighing her fear. She charged into the forest, leaving the flickering campfire and her terrified friends behind. Kevin hesitated for a moment, then followed, calling out for her to stop. The forest swallowed them. The dense canopy overhead blocked out the moonlight, and the deeper they went, the darker it became. Emma's flashlight cut a narrow path through the blackness, its beam trembling as she ran. The voice came again, closer now. "Help me, please!" It sounded like Jake, but there was something wrong, something hollow in the way the words echoed through the trees. Emma slowed, her breathing ragged as she scanned the area. "Jake," she called. "Where are you?" A shadow moved in the corner of her vision, and she swung the flashlight toward it. For a moment, she thought she saw him, Jake, standing in the distance, his face pale and his clothes torn. "Jake!" she shouted, running toward him. But as she approached, the figure turned and stepped into the light. It wasn't Jake. The thing wore his face like a mask, but its eyes were empty, black holes that seemed to stretch into infinity. Its body was wrong, too tall and too thin, its arms bending at unnatural angles. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The thing tilted its head, mimicking Jake's crooked smile. Then it opened its mouth, and Jake's voice came out, distorted and mechanical. "Help me!" Emma screamed, stumbling back as the thing took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as it reached for her with impossibly long fingers. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the darkness, and Kevin appeared, his flashlight trained on the creature. "Emma, run!" he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. The thing didn't follow. It stood there, its empty eyes watching them as they ran, its smile widening until it seemed to split its face in two. When they returned to the clearing, Sarah and Linda were waiting, their faces pale and streaked with tears. "What happened?" Sarah cried, rushing to Emma. "There's something out there," Emma gasped, collapsing onto the ground. It looked like Jake. but it wasn't him. "It's the Jersey Devil," Linda whispered, her voice trembling. "Or something worse. We're not supposed to be here. We need to leave." Emma shook her head. "We can't leave Jake behind." Sarah grabbed her by the shoulders, her eyes wild. "Jake is gone, Emma. Whatever you saw, it's not him." Before Emma could respond, the fire flickered again, drawing their attention. The flames shifted, casting strange shadows across the clearing. Then, from the darkness, came a low, guttural growl. The group turned toward the sound, their flashlights trembling as they pointed them toward the trees. The growl grew louder, closer, and then silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without warning, a massive shadow lunged from the forest, knocking Kevin to the ground. The others screamed as the thing, its form too fast and chaotic to see clearly, dragged him toward the trees. "Kevin!" Emma shouted, running after him. But by the time she reached the edge of the forest, he was gone. In the silence that followed, only one sound remained. A faint, distorted voice echoing through the trees. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" The clearing felt smaller now, as though the forest itself was closing in. The trees leaned closer, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the faintest light from the stars. Emma, Sarah, and Linda sat huddled near the dying campfire, their faces pale and tear-streaked. The oppressive silence was broken only by Sarah's shaky breathing. "He's gone," Linda whispered, staring into the embers. "First Jake, now Kevin. We're next." Emma clenched her fists, her mind racing. "We can't just sit here. There has to be a way out. Maybe if we head back the way we came." "We tried that," Sarah interrupted, her voice cracking. "Don't you remember?" "It just brought us back here." Emma fell silent. She didn't want to admit it, but Sarah was right. After Kevin was taken, they'd tried to leave, running blindly through the forest in a desperate attempt to find the van. But no matter which direction they went, they always ended up back in the clearing. It was as if the forest itself was alive, herding them like cattle. "Then what do we do?" Linda asked, her voice barely audible. Emma didn't answer. She stared at the fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the ground. Her thoughts drifted to the creature she'd seen, the thing that wore Jake's face. It wasn't human, it wasn't even close, but it had spoken. It had called for help. What if it wasn't lying? What if, somehow, Jake and Kevin were still alive? As the first hints of dawn broke through the dense canopy, Emma stood and grabbed her flashlight. "I'm going back," she announced. Linda looked up, horrified. "Back where?" "You can't be serious." "I have to find them," Emma said, her voice firm. "I can't just leave them out there." "You won't find them," Sarah said quietly, not looking up. "Whatever took them, it's not going to let them go." "Maybe not," Emma replied, "but I have to try." Linda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Emma admitted, "but if it were me out there, I'd want you to try." She turned and started toward the forest. To her surprise, Sarah stood and followed. "I'm not letting you go alone," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Sarah, no," Linda pleaded. "Don't do this." But Sarah shook her head. "We came here together. We're leaving together." Linda didn't move. She sat frozen by the fire as Emma and Sarah disappeared into the trees, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. The forest was even more oppressive in the early morning light. The twisted trees seemed to close in tighter, their gnarled branches clawing at the air. The ground beneath Emma's feet felt spongy, like she was walking on something alive. "You think we're going to find them?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma didn't answer. She kept her flashlight trained on the ground, scanning for any sign of footprints or disturbed earth. But there was nothing. It was as if Jake and Kevin had vanished into thin air. The whispering began again, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. Emma stopped, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Sarah nodded, her face pale. "It's them." The whispers grew louder, surrounding them like a swarm of invisible insects. Emma turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then a voice broke through the whispers, a single clear word. "Help." Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was Jake's voice, unmistakable and desperate. "Jake!" she called, spinning around. "Where are you?" "Emma," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I don't think that's him." But Emma wasn't listening. She pushed forward, following the sound of Jake's voice as it called her name. The trees grew denser, the air heavier, until finally she stumbled into another clearing. And there he was. Jake stood in the center of the clearing, his back to her. His clothes were torn, his hair matted with dirt, but he was alive. "Jake!" Emma cried, running toward him. "Emma, no!" Sarah shouted, but it was too late. Emma reached out to grab Jake's shoulder, but the moment she touched him, his body twisted unnaturally, his head snapping around to face her. His eyes were black pits, his mouth stretched into an inhuman grin. "Help me," he said, his voice echoing and distorted. Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding. "Jake, what happened to you?" But Jake didn't answer. He lunged forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. Emma screamed, falling to the ground as he loomed over her. Then a beam of light cut through the darkness, and Jake froze. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, her flashlight trained on him. "Get away from her!" Sarah shouted. Jake let out a guttural growl, his body contorting as he turned towards Sarah. For a moment he seemed ready to attack, but then he stopped. Slowly he stepped back into the shadows, his black eyes never leaving theirs, and then he was gone. Emma and Sarah didn't speak as they stumbled back to the clearing. When they arrived, they found Linda sitting by the fire, her face pale and tear-streaked. "What happened?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. Emma collapsed onto the ground, her hands shaking. "It wasn't him," she whispered. "It looked like him, but it wasn't him." Linda stared at her, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "Then what was it?" Emma didn't answer. She stared into the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across her face. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Whatever's in this forest, it's not going to stop." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "We're leaving. But first, we're going to find out what this thing is." The fire in the clearing sputtered weakly, barely holding on against the encroaching dampness of the forest air. Emma, Sarah, and Linda sat in silence, their faces drawn and pale. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy above, but it brought no warmth, only long, eerie shadows that danced across the forest floor. Every crackle of the fire or rustle in the undergrowth set their nerves on edge. "We can't stay here," Sarah finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she gripped the flashlight. "It's only a matter of time before that thing comes back." "But where do we go?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've tried leaving. The forest won't let us." Emma's eyes flicked to the torn tents, the word "stay" still scratched deeply into the dirt. She clenched her fists. "Then we don't leave," she said. "Not yet." Sarah turned to her, her face a mix of fear and confusion. "What are you talking about? You want to stay here after what we've seen?" Emma nodded, her jaw tight. "That thing, it's playing with us, hurting us. There's a reason it hasn't killed us yet, and I'm going to find out why." "How?" Linda demanded, her voice rising. "You think you can just walk up to it and ask for answers?" "No," Emma admitted, her gaze hardening. "But I think we need to stop running. If we're going to survive, we have to understand what we're dealing with. Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. This is insane, she muttered. But I guess we don't have much of a choice. The plan was simple. Stay in the clearing, keep the fire going, and wait for the creature to return. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The forest seemed to grow quieter with every passing moment, as if holding its breath. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispers began again. "Help me." The voice was faint at first, carried on the wind like a distant echo. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to come from all directions at once. Linda clamped her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't." "Stay calm," Emma said, though her own heart was pounding. She grabbed a long stick from the fire, its tip glowing with embers. "Whatever happens, don't run. That's what it wants." The whispers suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence in their wake. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped into the clearing. It was Kevin. At least it looked like Kevin. His clothes were torn and stained with dirt, and his face was gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in days. But his eyes were wrong. They were dark and empty, like twin voids that swallowed the light. "Kevin?" Linda gasped, her voice trembling with hope and fear. She took a step forward, but Sarah grabbed her arm. "Don't!" Sarah hissed. "It's not him!" Kevin tilted his head, his movements jerky and unnatural. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. "Help me," he said, his voice hollow and distorted. Emma tightened her grip on the burning stick, her knuckles white. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Kevin's grin widened, and he took a step closer. "Help me," he repeated, the words echoing unnaturally. Linda broke free from Sarah's grip, tears streaming down her face. "Kevin, it's me! Linda! Please tell me it's you!" "Linda, no!" Sarah shouted, but it was too late. Linda ran toward him, her arms outstretched. For a brief moment, Kevin's expression changed. His grin faltered, and his eyes seemed to flicker with something: pain, fear, humanity. But then, his body twisted violently, his limbs elongating into grotesque clawed appendages. He let out a guttural scream, and the clearing erupted into chaos. Emma lunged forward, swinging the burning stick at the creature. The embers flared as they connected with its twisted form, and it shrieked, recoiling into the shadows. Sarah grabbed Linda, pulling her back toward the fire as the creature circled them, its dark eyes glowing in the dim light. "We need to keep it back!" Emma shouted, jabbing the stick into the darkness. The creature hissed, its movements erratic as it retreated further into the trees. For a moment, silence returned. The three women huddled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. But then, from the shadows, more shapes began to emerge. There were dozens of them, figures that looked almost human, but not quite. Their bodies were twisted and broken, their faces stretched into horrifying masks of agony. They moved slowly, deliberately, their empty eyes fixed on the group. Emma's grip on the stick faltered as the realization hit her. "They're the others," she whispered. "The people who disappeared." Sarah shook her head, her voice trembling. No, they can't be." The creatures advanced, their distorted voices blending into a chilling chorus. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" Linda screamed, clutching at Sarah as the creatures closed in. Emma raised the burning stick, her heart pounding as she braced for the inevitable. Then, from the depths of the forest, a new sound emerged, a low, guttural growl that silenced even the creatures. The air grew colder, the fire sputtering as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. And then it appeared. It was massive, its body cloaked in shadows that seemed to writhe and shift like smoke. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its presence filled the clearing with a suffocating weight. The other creatures fell back, their twisted forms trembling in its presence. The Jersey Devil. Emma stared in horror as the creature stepped closer, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, it opened its mouth, and a single guttural word echoed through the clearing. Leave. The clearing was frozen in an unnatural stillness, as if even time itself had paused in fear of the monstrous presence towering before them. The Jersey Devil, if that's what it truly was, stood motionless, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Around it, the twisted humanoid figures retreated, their grotesque forms trembling as they melted into the shadows of the forest. Emma's breath came in short gasps as she gripped the smoldering stick tighter, its feeble glow no match for the suffocating darkness around them. Sarah clung to Linda, her eyes wide with terror, while Linda stared at the creature, her mouth moving soundlessly as if praying. The devil tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate like a predator sizing up its prey. Then, in a deep, guttural voice that seemed to reverberate through their very bones, it spoke again. Leave. Emma took a shaky step forward, her knees threatening to buckle under the sheer weight of its gaze. We can't, she stammered. Not without Jake. And Kevin. The creature's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw something human in its gaze, something ancient and sorrowful. But then it bared its jagged teeth, a sound like a low growl rumbling from deep within its chest. You stay. You die. Emma, Sarah whispered urgently, tugging at her sleeve. We have to go, now. But Emma didn't move. Something about the creature's words, the way it spoke, made her hesitate. It wasn't just a mindless monster. It understood them, spoke to them, and she had to know why. What do you want? Emma asked, her voice steadier now. Why are you keeping us here? The Jersey Devil tilted its head again, and the shadows around it seemed to writhe like living things. You disturb the forest. You awaken what should sleep. Emma's mind raced. The others, she said, glancing toward the spot where the twisted figures had disappeared. The people who disappeared, are they still alive? The devil's eyes narrowed, its body lowering slightly as if preparing to pounce. They are taken, it said. Changed. Changed into what? Emma demanded. But deep down, she already knew the answer. The devil let out a bone-chilling roar, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The fire sputtered out completely, plunging the clearing into total darkness. Emma grabbed Sarah and Linda, dragging them backward as the devil stepped closer, its massive frame cutting off their escape. Run! Emma screamed, shoving the others toward the edge of the clearing. Go! Now! But... Sarah started, her voice choked with panic. Just go! Emma yelled, swinging the stick in a wide arc. The embers flared, forcing the creature to momentarily recoil. I'll hold it off! Linda grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her into the trees. The two disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps fading quickly. Emma turned back to face the devil, her heart pounding as it stepped closer. You are brave, the devil said, its voice almost admiring. But bravery will not save you. Emma held her ground, raising the stick like a sword. Then I'll die fighting. The devil lunged. Meanwhile, Sarah and Linda stumbled blindly through the forest, their flashlights flickering as they weaved through the dense undergrowth. The whispers had returned, growing louder with every step, and the shadows seemed to move around them, blocking their path. We're not going to make it, Linda sobbed, her breath hitching as she tripped over a root. Yes, we are, Sarah said firmly, pulling her to her feet. Just keep moving. They burst into another clearing, this one smaller and eerily quiet. In the center stood a crumbling stone structure, a chapel, long abandoned and overgrown with vines. Its stained glass windows were cracked, the colorful shards scattered across the ground. "Do you think—" Linda started, but Sarah was already running toward the building. Inside, the air was cold and damp, the smell of decay filling their nostrils. A single altar stood at the far end, its surface covered in strange symbols carved deep into the stone. "What is this place?" Linda whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Sarah said, running her fingers over the carvings. The symbols glowed faintly under her touch, as if reacting to her presence. "But maybe it's—" Her words were cut off by a deafening roar. The ground shook, and the devil's hulking form appeared in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Emma staggered into the chapel moments later, clutching her side where the devil had struck her. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, but she didn't stop. "Sarah! Linda!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "We're here!" Sarah called, waving from the altar. "Hurry!" Emma ran toward them, the devil close behind. As she reached the altar, Sarah pressed her hand against the center of the glowing carvings, and a sudden wave of energy rippled through the room. The devil let out a roar of rage, its movements slowing as if weighed down by an invisible force. "What did you do?" Emma asked, breathing heavily. "I don't know," Sarah shouted. I think it's trapped." The devil thrashed against the unseen barrier, its roars shaking the walls of the chapel. The carvings on the altar glowed brighter, and the air grew thick with static. "It's working!" Linda cried. "We can stop it!" But Emma wasn't so sure. The devil's movements were slowing, but its eyes burned brighter than ever, filled with a rage that promised it wouldn't stay trapped for long. "We have to go," Emma said, grabbing the others. "Now." "What about the others?" Sarah asked. "The ones it took?" Emma hesitated, her heart aching at the thought of Jake and Kevin, but she knew the truth. They were gone. Whatever the devil had done to them, it couldn't be undone. "They're not coming back," Emma said softly. "I'm sorry." The three women ran from the chapel, the devil's roars echoing behind them. As they reached the edge of the forest, the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, casting long shadows across the ground. They found the van where they had left it, covered in dirt and leaves as though it had been sitting there for years. Emma fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she started the engine. As they drove away, the forest seemed to sigh, its shadows retreating into the distance. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. Not really. The devil was still out there, waiting for the next group of fools to disturb its domain. And the whispers never truly stopped.